The strangest thing about forgotten names is that sometimes they remember us before we remember them. The desert morning arrived quietly over the military base. Pale sunlight spilled across rows of temporary buildings, while a cool breeze carried dust through the empty pathways. Most people were still waking up. Generators hummed. Coffee brewed. Radios crackled with routine updates. Nothing about the morning seemed unusual. Emily Carter liked it that way. She stepped into the medical clinic just before sunrise, balancing a clipboard under one arm and a steaming cup of coffee in the other. Within minutes, she was checking supply inventories, reviewing patient schedules, and organizing equipment that nobody else would notice needed attention. She worked with the calm confidence of someone who had repeated the same routine hundreds of times. Patients trusted her. Staff respected her. Yet very few people knew anything about her beyond the fact that she was a combat nurse assigned to the base. Emily preferred it that way. Across the compound, Captain Ryan Walker walked toward the operations building carrying a folder filled with reports. He had spent most of the previous night reviewing logistics plans for an upcoming training cycle. Like everyone else at the base, he knew Emily only in passing. She was efficient, professional, quiet, the kind of person people appreciated but rarely discussed. At least, that was what he believed. Around mid-morning, Emily finished helping an injured mechanic, updated several medical records, and stepped outside for a short break. She sat alone beneath a faded shade canopy near the clinic entrance. In her hands rested a worn paperback novel. To anyone passing by, she looked completely ordinary. Just another medical professional enjoying a few peaceful minutes before returning to work. Yet if someone had watched carefully, they might have noticed certain things. The way her eyes constantly scanned the environment without appearing to. The way she instinctively observed movement at the edges of the compound. The way she seemed aware of details that most people ignored. Not because she was suspicious, because it had become part of who she was. Nearby, two younger personnel walked past discussing a recent training exercise. One of them accidentally dropped a small notebook without realizing it. Before either man had taken 3 more steps, Emily looked up from her book. "You dropped something," she called. The soldier turned around, surprised. He had not heard the notebook fall. Neither had his friend. Emily simply smiled and returned to reading. Small moments like that happened often. Nobody thought much about them. They should have. Later that afternoon, Ryan entered the administration office to sign several routine documents. A stack of personnel files waited on a nearby desk. While searching for one report, he accidentally opened the wrong folder. The name on the cover caught his attention. Emily Carter. He intended to close it immediately. Then something unusual drew his eye. Most records followed a predictable format. This one did not. Near the bottom of an older page, partially hidden beneath an administrative correction, appeared a single line that seemed out of place. It was not a rank, not a qualification, not a unit designation. Just one word. Falcon. Ryan stared at it for several seconds. Then he looked again. Someone had attempted to remove the reference years earlier. Yet the word remained visible enough to read. Falcon. He had no idea what it meant. But something about it felt important. Outside the office window, the afternoon sun settled over the desert. In the clinic across the compound, Emily continued helping patients without the slightest idea that a forgotten piece of her past had just begun its journey back into the light. The word remained in Ryan Walker's mind far longer than it should have. By the next morning, he had already convinced himself it was probably meaningless. A clerical note, an old training designation, a forgotten administrative detail that survived a filing error. Yet every time he thought he had dismissed it, the same word returned. Falcon. The military generated thousands of names, codes, and identifiers every year. Most disappeared into archives without anyone remembering them. This one felt different. Ryan could not explain why. He arrived at the operations building before sunrise and immediately buried himself in reports. Training schedules, equipment requests, personnel evaluations. The usual rhythm of military life. For several hours, the mystery disappeared beneath routine responsibilities. Then, shortly before lunch, he saw Emily Carter crossing the compound. She carried a medical supply case in one hand and a stack of paperwork in the other. Nothing unusual, nothing remarkable. Yet Ryan found himself watching her a little longer than before. Not because he suspected anything, because he was trying to understand why a forgotten word in an old file seemed connected to her so strongly. Across the base, Emily continued her day without noticing the attention. She helped a communications technician who had strained his shoulder while lifting equipment. She reviewed medication inventories. She spent nearly 30 minutes listening patiently to a young service member worried about a family issue back home. Her ability to make people feel heard impressed everyone around her. Even those who barely knew her trusted her almost immediately. It was one of her gifts. Later that afternoon, Ryan found himself in the records office again. This time his visit was intentional. He requested several archived personnel references connected to Emily's early service history. The clerk searched the database for a few moments before shaking his head. Most of those records are restricted or incomplete. Ryan frowned. Restricted? Not classified, the clerk replied. Just unavailable. That answer created more questions than it solved. Emily was a combat nurse. Why would portions of her early service history be inaccessible? Ryan thanked the clerk and left with no new information except a growing sense that something important remained hidden beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Emily spent the late afternoon at a temporary outreach clinic near a nearby village. Children waited outside with their families. Elderly residents sat beneath shade structures while medical personnel moved between stations. Emily greeted each person warmly. She remembered names. She remembered stories. She remembered details most people forgot. An elderly man arrived carrying a weathered photograph of his grandchildren. Emily recognized him immediately from a previous visit months earlier. The old man smiled when she asked about them by name. Moments like that mattered to her. Far more than rank. Far more than recognition. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, a military transport vehicle arrived at the clinic carrying several visitors from another installation. Among them was an older veteran who had spent decades working around military training programs. He stepped out slowly and looked around while staff members greeted the group. Then his eyes settled on Emily. He stopped walking. Completely. The expression on his face changed in an instant. Surprise. Disbelief. Recognition. Emily looked up from a patient chart and saw him standing there. For the briefest moment, she froze as well. Not dramatically, just enough for someone paying attention to notice. The veteran stared at her as though he had seen a ghost from another lifetime. Emily recovered first. Her professional smile returned. She greeted him politely. The man nodded, but his eyes never left her face. Something passed between them. Not fear. Not discomfort. Recognition. Pure and undeniable. Several nearby personnel noticed the exchange, but did not understand it. Neither did Ryan, who arrived moments later to coordinate transportation arrangements. He caught only the end of the encounter. Yet one thing became immediately clear. The older veteran knew Emily. More importantly, he knew something about her that nobody else on the base seemed to know. And for the first time since discovering that forgotten word in her file, Ryan realized he might finally be getting closer to the truth. The encounter stayed with Ryan Walker long after the outreach clinic visit ended. Most people would have forgotten it. A brief moment. An older veteran recognizing someone from years ago. Nothing unusual. Yet Ryan had spent enough time around military personnel to recognize genuine surprise when he saw it. The look on the veteran's face had not been casual recognition. It had been the look of someone discovering a chapter of history he never expected to see again. 2 days later, Ryan finally learned the man's name. Thomas Grayson. Retired. Former instructor. Decades of service. An impressive career filled with training assignments and specialized programs. The kind of person who had met thousands of military professionals throughout his life, which made his reaction to Emily even harder to ignore. Late that afternoon, Ryan found Grayson sitting outside the dining facility drinking coffee beneath a faded canvas awning. The desert wind moved slowly across the compound. Shadows stretched longer as the sun descended toward the horizon. Ryan greeted him and sat down. For several minutes, they discussed ordinary topics. Base operations. Training standards. Changes within the military over the years. Then Ryan finally asked the question he had been carrying since the outreach clinic. You know Emily Carter. Grayson became very still. Not defensive. Not uncomfortable. Simply thoughtful. He stared into his coffee cup before answering. Yes. Ryan waited. The older man smiled faintly. Although not by that name. The words landed with unexpected weight. Ryan leaned forward slightly. What does that mean? Grayson looked toward the medical clinic across the compound where Emily was helping several patients. It means the woman working in that building is not the person most people think she is. Ryan immediately thought of the word hidden in her file. Falcon. He said nothing. Grayson continued. Years ago, I taught advanced observation and field assessment programs. He paused. Emily was one of the most talented students I ever met. Ryan remained silent. Not because she was naturally gifted, Grayson added. Because she noticed things other people ignored. The explanation sounded familiar. Suddenly, dozens of small moments from the past few weeks connected together. The dropped notebook. The communications equipment. The forgotten route details. The calibration marker. Ryan finally understood why those moments felt different. Emily was not guessing. She was observing. Grayson smiled softly. Most people remember achievements. I remember habits. He pointed toward the clinic. Even back then she noticed everything. Ryan looked across the compound. Emily laughed gently at something an elderly patient said before helping him toward a shaded chair. She looked exactly like the person everyone believed her to be. A combat nurse. Compassionate. Reliable. Ordinary. Yet the more Ryan learned, the less ordinary she appeared. That evening, he found Emily organizing supplies after most personnel had left for dinner. Shelves lined the walls. Medical kits sat neatly arranged across work tables. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. Ryan stood in the doorway. Can I ask you something? Emily glanced up and smiled. That depends. Ryan laughed. Everyone says that you notice everything. Emily returned a package of supplies to its proper location. Not everything. More than most people. She shrugged. Maybe. Ryan hesitated before speaking again. Did you ever have another name? For the first time since he had met her, Emily stopped moving completely. The silence lasted only a few seconds. Yet it felt much longer. She slowly looked up at him. Her expression remained calm, but something distant appeared behind her eyes. Something old. Something carefully protected. Then she smiled politely. No, the answer sounded simple. Yet Ryan knew immediately it was not the whole truth. Emily returned to her work. The conversation ended. But as Ryan walked back across the compound beneath the fading desert sky, one realization became impossible to ignore. Emily Carter was carrying a past she had worked very hard to leave behind. And whatever that past contained, it was connected to a name she no longer wanted anyone to speak aloud. For the next several days, Ryan Walker tried to let the matter go. He told himself Emily Carter deserved her privacy. Everyone carried pieces of their past they preferred not to revisit. Yet the more he respected her decision, the more obvious it became that something larger existed beneath the surface. Not because of secrets, because of the way other people reacted whenever they recognized her. The pattern continued. A visiting communications specialist paused after meeting her and asked where she had trained. A retired instructor passing through the base spent nearly 10 minutes staring at her before finally shaking his head in disbelief. Even Thomas Grayson seemed careful whenever Emily entered a conversation. Nobody openly explained why. Nobody directly challenged her. They simply treated her with a level of respect that seemed disconnected from the role she currently held. One evening, shortly after sunset, Ryan found Grayson standing alone near the edge of the compound. The older man watched the desert horizon while the last traces of daylight disappeared behind distant mountains. You almost said something the other day, Ryan remarked. Grayson smiled slightly. I did. Ryan folded his arms. Why did you stop? The veteran remained silent for several moments. Finally he answered. Because it was never my story to tell. The response frustrated Ryan more than he expected. Then why does everyone act like they know something important? Grayson looked toward the medical clinic where lights still glowed through the windows. Because some names become larger than the people who carried them. Ryan immediately thought of the word hidden inside Emily's file. The word nobody seemed willing to explain. Grayson noticed the realization forming behind his eyes. Leave it alone, he said quietly. If she wants to talk about it, she will. Later that night, Ryan crossed the compound and saw Emily sitting outside the clinic. A notebook rested on her lap. The desert air felt unusually cool. For a few minutes neither spoke. Then Ryan sat beside her. Can I ask one more question? Emily smiled faintly. You keep asking that. Ryan laughed. And you keep making it difficult. The smile remained for only a moment before fading. What do you want to know? Ryan looked toward the dark horizon. Why does everyone who recognizes you react the same way? Emily's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not fear. Not anger. Something closer to sadness. She closed the notebook. Because they remember a different person. Ryan turned toward her. Was she that different? Emily stared into the darkness for several seconds before answering. Yes. The word arrived softly. Honest. Final. Ryan waited for more. None came. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Emily stood and picked up the notebook. Good night, Captain. Then she walked back into the clinic. The conversation ended there. 2 days later, the base received an unexpected request from a remote observation team participating in a large regional training exercise. The request itself seemed routine. Communication support, position updates, coordination checks. Nothing unusual. Yet throughout the day, reports continued arriving describing one persistent problem. Contact with a key observer had become increasingly unreliable. Equipment issues, terrain interference, signal disruptions. Multiple attempts to establish stable communication failed. Personnel discussed solutions during briefings and planning sessions. Nobody appeared overly concerned. It was, after all, only an exercise. Still, the situation lingered in the background of every conversation. That evening, as officers reviewed updates inside the operations center, another transmission arrived. The connection lasted only a few moments before disappearing again. Frustration spread through the room. Different personnel suggested different approaches. None seemed to work. Across the room, Emily happened to be delivering updated medical readiness reports. She set the paperwork on a table and prepared to leave. Then a fragment of audio echoed through a nearby speaker. Just a few distorted words. Barely understandable. Most people ignored it. Emily stopped walking. Completely. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Not because she recognized the voice. Because she recognized something else. A pattern. A cadence. A piece of the past she thought she had left behind forever. For the first time in years, a memory stirred that she had spent a very long time trying not to hear. The room returned to its discussion almost immediately. Officers reviewed reports. Communications specialists adjusted equipment. New recommendations appeared on screens throughout the operations center. Yet Emily Carter remained standing exactly where she was. The distorted transmission had lasted less than 3 seconds. Most people heard static. Emily heard something else. Not words. Not a voice. A communication pattern she had not encountered in years. Across the room, Ryan Walker noticed her reaction. It was subtle. Anyone else might have missed it. Emily rarely displayed emotion. Now she looked distant, as if part of her attention had traveled somewhere far beyond the walls of the building. Another transmission arrived. Again, the signal faded before anyone could establish meaningful contact. Frustration spread through the operations team. One specialist removed his headset and sighed. We keep getting fragments, but nothing usable. Another technician pointed toward a display screen. Signal quality keeps collapsing before the relay locks in. Several suggestions followed. None solved the problem. Emily quietly placed the medical reports on a nearby table. She should have left. Instead, she remained near the doorway listening. Thomas Grayson happened to enter the operations center at that moment. The retired instructor scanned the room and quickly recognized the atmosphere. Something unusual was happening. Then he saw Emily. The moment he noticed her expression, his own face changed. Recognition. Concern. Understanding. He moved closer. What is it? He asked softly. Emily did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the communications display. The pattern, she said. It sounds familiar. Another burst of fragmented audio filled the room. Static. Interference. Then silence. Most personnel returned to troubleshooting technical explanations. Emily lowered her gaze. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Long nights beneath open skies. Observation posts. Call signs exchanged through distant radios. Voices reduced to fragments by terrain and weather. She pushed the memory away. Ryan approached her. You recognize it? Emily shook her head. Not exactly. Yet the answer sounded uncertain. Across the room, a communications officer finally received a partial update from the remote exercise team. The message explained that one observer remained isolated from the primary relay network. Safe. Accounted for. But increasingly difficult to reach. Multiple attempts to restore stable contact had failed. Nobody appeared alarmed. The exercise continued. Still, the situation remained unresolved. Grayson folded his arms and listened carefully. Then his eyes moved toward Emily again. He knew exactly what she was thinking. More importantly, he knew why she was trying not to think it. As evening settled across the desert, personnel continued searching for solutions. New frequencies were tested. Alternate relays were activated. Temporary workarounds were proposed. Nothing produced reliable communication. The observer remained little more than a voice trapped behind static. Finally, shortly before midnight, another transmission broke through. This time a few words emerged clearly before fading. The room became silent. Every person stopped talking. The voice disappeared almost immediately. Yet the brief message contained something unexpected. A call sign. Not the isolated observer's current identifier. An older one. A name apparently remembered by whoever was trying to reach him. Most people ignored the significance. They assumed it was part of the exercise. Grayson did not. His eyes immediately moved toward Emily. Ryan followed his gaze. Emily stood perfectly still. The color had drained slightly from her face. Nobody spoke. The room remained quiet except for the low hum of equipment. Then Grayson looked toward the communications station and slowly exhaled. For years he had respected Emily's decision to leave the past behind. He had never questioned it, never challenged it. But now he understood something the others did not. The voice reaching through the static was connected to a world Emily had spent years trying to forget. A world where names carried weight, where call signs became identities. And somewhere beyond the broken transmission, a forgotten chapter of her life was beginning to call her back. The operations center remained unusually quiet long after the transmission ended. Screens continued updating. Radios continued cycling through frequencies. Technicians continued working through possible solutions. Yet beneath the routine activity, something had changed. The room felt different, heavier somehow. Emily Carter stood near the communications station, watching information scroll across a monitor. She had not moved much during the past several minutes. Ryan Walker noticed. So did Thomas Grayson. Neither interrupted her thoughts. Another signal attempt failed. Static filled the speakers before fading into silence once again. One communications specialist rubbed his eyes and leaned back in frustration. We are close enough to hear fragments, but not close enough to establish consistency. Another technician nodded. The terrain keeps interfering with the relay path. Ryan studied the situation board. The isolated observer remained safe according to every available report. The problem was communication. Nobody could maintain reliable contact long enough to coordinate effectively. Different teams proposed different technical fixes. Nothing lasted. Then another short burst of audio emerged from the speakers. Distorted, broken, barely understandable. Most people heard noise. Emily's eyes closed briefly. This time she recognized more than a pattern. She recognized methodology. Whoever was attempting contact on the far end was using an older observation communication protocol designed to maximize clarity under difficult conditions. A system almost nobody used anymore. A system she knew extremely well. Grayson stepped beside her. You remember it. Emily looked at the floor. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she answered quietly. I remember all of it. The words carried a weight Ryan had never heard in her voice before. Across the room, another failed transmission attempt triggered fresh discussions. Nobody paid attention to the conversation happening near the communications station. Nobody except Ryan. He approached slowly. What exactly is going on? Grayson glanced toward him, then toward Emily. The decision clearly belonged to her. Emily folded her arms and stared at the glowing monitor. Memories moved through her mind like distant echoes. Training ranges beneath endless skies. Observation posts hidden among mountains. Voices traveling through static. Call signs repeated hundreds of times until they became part of identity itself. Years ago, she had left all of it behind. Not because she hated it. Because she wanted a different life. A quieter life. A life measured by people helped instead of accomplishments collected. Another transmission crackled through the speakers. A few fragmented words emerged. Then silence. Emily lowered her head. Ryan watched her carefully. You know something, he said. It was not a question. Emily slowly nodded. The room continued working around them. Nobody realized how close they were to understanding the mystery that had followed her for years. Finally, Ryan asked the question he had carried since finding that single word hidden in her file. What was Falcon? The silence that followed seemed to stop time itself. Emily looked toward the communications equipment, then toward Grayson. The older man said nothing. He simply waited. For a moment, Ryan thought she might walk away. Instead, she exhaled slowly. The expression on her face was not pride. It was resignation. Acceptance. Like someone opening a door they had kept closed for a very long time. Falcon was a call sign, she said quietly. Ryan stared at her. Grayson lowered his eyes. Neither man spoke. Emily looked back toward the speaker where distant static still drifted through the room. A long time ago, she continued, it belonged to me. The words landed like a stone in still water. Small, simple, yet impossible to ignore. Across the operations center, nobody noticed the revelation. They remained focused on screens and frequencies and reports. But Ryan understood immediately that everything had just changed. The mysterious word hidden in her file was no longer a mystery. The forgotten identity was real. And somewhere beyond the broken communications network, something connected to that identity was still reaching through the darkness, waiting for an answer only one person could give. Nobody in the operations center realized they had just witnessed the most important revelation of the night. To everyone else, the room remained focused on technical problems. Frequencies, relays, terrain interference, communication failures. Only 3 people understood that something far larger had happened. Emily Carter stood silently beside the communication station. Ryan Walker remained frozen beside her. Thomas Grayson looked away, giving her the privacy of someone who understood how difficult that admission had been. Falcon. The call sign hung in the air long after the word was spoken. Emily had not heard it spoken aloud in years. For a long time she believed she never would again. Another transmission attempt crackled through the speakers. Static filled the room. Then silence. One technician adjusted a headset and shook his head. Still not enough. Another specialist studied a signal diagram displayed across multiple monitors. We are close, he said. Something keeps breaking the connection at the last second. Emily listened carefully, not to the technicians, to the rhythm hidden inside the static. The pattern felt familiar. The timing, the pauses, the repeated attempts. Years earlier, she had spent countless hours listening to signals under difficult conditions. She knew what persistence sounded like. She knew what determination sounded like. And somewhere beyond the mountains, somebody was refusing to stop trying. Ryan finally spoke. Can you help? Emily did not answer immediately. She watched the signal monitor as another burst of interference crossed the screen. Maybe. The word barely rose above a whisper. Grayson studied her face. He recognized the conflict immediately. This was never about skill. Emily had never doubted her ability. The real question was whether she was willing to reopen a part of herself she had spent years leaving behind. The room suddenly became quiet as a stronger transmission emerged. For the first time all evening, several complete words came through clearly before dissolving into static again. Every technician immediately turned toward the speakers. One communications officer replayed the recording. Then again. Fragments repeated through the room. Most people focused on the missing information. Emily focused on what remained. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She stepped closer to the console. Play it again. The technician obeyed without hesitation. Static. Distortion. A few words. Silence. Emily listened. Then listened again. The room waited. Ryan noticed that every conversation had stopped. Even people who knew nothing about Falcon seemed aware that something important was happening. Emily looked at the frequency display, then at the terrain map mounted on the wall, then back at the transmission data. Slowly, a realization appeared behind her eyes. The relay path is wrong, she said. The lead technician frowned. What? Emily walked toward the map. Her movements remained calm, measured, familiar. She pointed toward a ridgeline marked near the isolated observer's position. Everyone assumes the signal is trying to travel through the nearest relay. The technician nodded. Because it should. Emily shook her head. Not if they are using the older protocol. Silence filled the room. Grayson smiled faintly. He already knew where this was going. Emily traced a different route across the map. The signal is reflecting off the western ridge before reaching us. Several technicians immediately checked the data. One after another, expressions changed. Surprise. Realization. Respect. Emily had identified in seconds what hours of analysis had missed. Yet she seemed completely unaware of the effect she was having on the room. Her attention remained fixed on the problem itself. Another transmission attempt began. The adjusted routing was entered into the system. Everyone watched. Static filled the speakers. Then the signal strengthened. Not perfect, but stronger. Noticeably stronger. For the first time all night, hope appeared across the room. Ryan looked at Emily. She stood quietly beside the map, arms folded, eyes focused on the display. The medic everyone thought they knew had disappeared. Not replaced by someone new. Revealed as someone they had never truly understood. And deep inside the growing silence of the operations center, a forgotten identity had begun answering a call it could no longer ignore. The signal continued to strengthen. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough for everyone in the operations center to notice the difference. Technicians who had spent hours fighting interference suddenly found themselves receiving longer fragments. Additional words emerged. Coordinates became clearer. Status updates became easier to understand. The atmosphere inside the room changed from frustration to cautious optimism. Nobody celebrated. Not yet. There was still work to do. Emily Carter remained near the communications console while specialists adjusted settings based on her observations. She never acted like she had solved anything extraordinary. In her mind, she had simply recognized a familiar pattern. Yet around the room, people were beginning to look at her differently. Ryan Walker noticed it immediately. Every time a new improvement appeared on the monitors, eyes drifted toward Emily. Not because she demanded attention, because she had earned trust. Another transmission arrived. This time the isolated observer's voice remained audible for nearly 15 seconds. The room became completely silent. Personnel listened carefully as the message came through with greater clarity than anyone had achieved all evening. The transmission still contained interference, but communication was finally possible. A technician smiled and pointed at the display. "We have stability." Another nodded. "Not perfect, but stable." Relief spread across the room. Several people exchanged tired smiles. Emily quietly stepped away from the console. As far as she was concerned, her part was finished. She began gathering the medical reports she had originally brought into the room hours earlier. Ryan watched her with disbelief. Most people would have remained in the center of attention. Emily seemed eager to disappear from it. Before she reached the doorway, Thomas Grayson spoke softly. "They should know." Emily stopped. The room remained busy enough that nobody overheard the conversation. She turned toward him. "Know what?" Grayson smiled sadly. "Why you recognized it so quickly?" Emily looked down at the reports in her hands. For several moments, she said nothing. Ryan waited beside them. Finally, she shook her head. "It does not matter." Grayson studied her face. "It mattered once." Emily looked toward the communications equipment. The speakers now carried clear exchanges between teams separated by difficult terrain. Personnel who had been struggling all day were finally accomplishing their mission. A small smile appeared on her face. What matters is that they can hear each other now. The answer ended the discussion. Later that night, after most personnel had left the operations center, Ryan and Emily walked across the compound beneath a sky crowded with stars. The desert air felt cool and still. Neither spoke for several minutes. Eventually, Ryan broke the silence. "You could have told people." Emily laughed quietly. "Told them what?" Ryan looked at her. "Who you were." She considered the question carefully. Then she looked toward the distant mountains beyond the base. "The truth." Ryan nodded. Emily smiled faintly. "The truth is that person existed a long time ago." Ryan thought about arguing. Instead, he listened. "People keep acting like Falcon was something special," she continued. "Maybe she was." Her voice remained calm. "But she was never the part of my life I valued most." The word surprised him. Emily glanced toward the medical clinic where she would begin work again in a few hours. Helping people was. They continued walking through the quiet darkness. Ryan finally understood what nobody else seemed to grasp. The most remarkable thing about Emily Carter was not the forgotten call sign. It was not the hidden training. It was not the reputation others remembered. The remarkable thing was that after achieving all of it, she had chosen a different path. A quieter path. And standing beneath the stars, Ryan realized that was the reason people respected her so deeply. Not because of who she had been. Because of who she chose to become. Years later, the story survived in the same way the most meaningful stories always survive. Not through official reports. Not through awards. Not through records stored in archives. It survived through people. Captain Ryan Walker had long since moved on to new assignments and eventually into a leadership role where younger personnel regularly sought his advice. One autumn afternoon, He stood inside a training facility addressing a group of new operators. The room was modern. Bright screens covered the walls. Advanced communication systems lined the training stations. Yet the questions remained the same as they had always been. What makes someone exceptional? What makes someone worth remembering? As the session ended, a young operator raised his hand. Who was the most impressive person you ever worked with? Ryan smiled. Over the years, he had been asked that question dozens of times. Most people expected stories about famous commanders, decorated specialists, or legendary missions. Instead, Ryan looked toward the window and thought about a quiet woman carrying a medical bag across a dusty military base. A combat nurse, he answered. The room became silent. Several people exchanged confused glances. Ryan laughed softly. That is exactly the reaction I had the first time I met her. He told them about Emily Carter. He described the woman everyone overlooked. The woman who noticed details others missed. The woman who carried a forgotten call sign she never talked about. He described the night when an entire operations center struggled to solve a problem and how Emily quietly recognized something nobody else saw. Most importantly, he described what happened afterward. Did she become famous? One operator asked. Ryan shook his head. No. Did she receive recognition? Another asked. Ryan smiled. Not the kind most people mean. The room waited. Ryan folded his arms. The remarkable thing was that she never wanted any of it. Thousands of miles away, Emily Carter lived a life very different from the one she had known years earlier. She worked at a community health center surrounded by mountains and pine forests. Families greeted her by name. Children ran into the clinic excited to tell her about school. Elderly patients trusted her completely. Every morning she arrived early. Every evening, she left knowing she had helped someone. It was exactly the life she had chosen. One afternoon, while organizing supplies in a storage room, a younger nurse asked her a simple question. How do you always notice things before everyone else? Emily laughed quietly. It was a question she had heard many times. Practice, she answered. The younger nurse smiled. You always say that. Emily nodded. Because it is true. She never mentioned old training programs. Never mentioned forgotten call signs. Never mentioned the people who still remembered her from another life. Those things no longer mattered to her. What mattered was the patient waiting in the next room. The family needing reassurance. The person who needed help today. Back at the training facility, the session finally ended. The young operators gathered their equipment and prepared to leave. Yet several remained behind to hear more about the nurse from Ryan's story. Ryan answered every question patiently. Then, after everyone had gone, he sat alone for a moment and remembered the desert night when he first learned the truth about Falcon. The funny thing was that over time, the call sign had become the least important part of the story. People remembered it because it sounded impressive. Ryan remembered something else. He remembered a woman who could have spent her life talking about what she once was, but chose instead to focus on who she could help. He remembered someone who understood that accomplishments fade, titles disappear, and reputations eventually become history. Character remains. As the afternoon sunlight filled the empty room, Ryan smiled and gathered his notes. People remembered the call sign. Emily remembered the people. That was the difference. And that was why nobody who truly knew her ever forgot her.